Welcome to our program, General Newton.
Daniel, always good to be with you, and I'm delighted to be back.
U.S. has imposed sanctions against Russia's two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. Also, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says that these measures and sanctions will hurt Russian economy. What is your assessment of this another U-turn of Trump's administration and big blow to Putin's economy?
I'm very glad to see that the president is now putting major sanctions on their two largest oil producers. By the way, Daniel, these are the first major sanctions of this type in the second Trump administration. So I applaud the president for doing this. I believe he's, and I've talked about this many times, but I think he's really now losing patience with Putin. He had canceled what was going to be proposed summit in Budapest. That's been canceled. You've got these new two oil companies being major sanctions placed against them. I don't think it's going to have an immediate impact, but it'll have maybe a more near or midterm impact on the Russian oil economy and so forth. All the while, I believe Putin he will not compromise with President Zelensky or Ukraine or with U.S. and NATO for that matter. I think Putin is now more dug in than we've seen in the last couple years. And so all counts are concerning, but I believe it's now time for the United States, along with NATO, European Union, and certainly Ukraine, to go less on the defensive and now go offensive in terms of these sanctions, providing offensive weapons capabilities and so forth. And we can get into talking about that. But my bottom line, Daniel, this is a good development, but it's going to take a little bit of time to see the impact actually play out on these sanctions on these Russian oil economies.
According to Bloomberg, Secretary Rubio played a significant role in convincing President Trump to also impose the sanctions against Russian economy. How do you see the main reasons behind this Trump's U-turn on Vladimir Putin?
Well, first and foremost, President Trump is obviously coming to really realize the fact is that, as I mentioned, Putin is even more dug in. You cannot negotiate with him. Putin still believes that he can win. He can still topple the Zelensky government and take the territory of Ukraine. I think the president is now convinced through not only our intel specialists, but also in his own judgment that Ukraine is just the first stop. There are other nations that could be threatened in the Baltics and even Poland. So the president has an appreciation for that. The other aspect of this is you mentioned Secretary of State Rubio. I want our viewers to understand that he plays a very key role now in the Trump administration. Not only is he Secretary of State, but he is also the national security advisor to the president. So the president is now more and more leaning on his advice in terms of how to deal with not only perhaps in the Mideast, but in the Caribbean and Venezuela, but certainly with regard now to Russia, specifically Putin, and how if he wants to end the war successfully, he's got to be more emboldened and play more hardball with Putin than we've seen to date in the second Trump administration.
Let's also cover the role of another high-rank U.S. officials. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he recently slammed Mr. Kirill Dmitriev's visit to the U.S. and said that that was a propaganda visit because Mr. Kirill Dmitriev was trying to convince U.S. Citizens, American public, that sanctions would not be a huge blow to Russian economy. What is your reading of that?
My reading on that is Secretary Bessent is a very strong Secretary of the Treasury, but he also is very focused on not only the economic financial aspect of it, but the national security aspect of it. When you think of our national security from the U.S. standpoint, our tools we use are certainly military, diplomatic, economic, finance, but also the information tool. And what you're seeing play out here is to counter this propaganda, if you will, or this psychological commentary, warfare commentary, is to counter that and provide the facts. And on those facts, that's how the United States leans forward. But Secretary Bessent, along with Secretary Rubio, has a very close relationship and the respect of the president, and that's how we're going to move forward. But it's not just economic, finance, and military. It's the information domain as well, is my point, Daniel, and that's what you're seeing playing out here with those comments from Secretary Bessent.
Let's also cover the possibility of Ukraine receiving Tomahawk cruise missile. We have discussed this matter before. However, do you have any kind of updates on this matter? Is this still on the table in the White House?
It is still on the table in the White House, and this is my opinion. I'm not speaking for President Trump here, but I believe he's leaning towards providing these Tomahawk cruise missiles on top of the sanctions on these two large Russian oil producers. So it's almost as if it's an iterative step that he's trying the diplomatic card, he's trying the economic finance card. I believe the next card to play, and I would advise the president, is to provide these Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. Because, again, as you and I have talked, anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200 to 1,300 mile range of these Tomahawk cruise missiles fired by Ukraine now holds a lot of the key capabilities in Russia. Could be command and control, logistics supply, could be drone manufacturing, ballistic missile manufacturing, even some of the bomber bases that have really now been, there's been a sanctuary for these capabilities. But if President Trump I firmly believe he wants to end the killing, but to do so, he's now, I believe, going to, at some point, going to release the opportunity to provide Tomahawks to Ukraine. So that will stop the killing faster than if we just continue to provide defensive weapons.
Also, according to Wall Street Journal, US has allowed Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia using British-made Storm Shadow cruise missile, and Ukraine has conducted numerous combined arms air attacks on Russia using British Storm Shadow cruise missile, Ukraine-made missile, and Ukraine-made short and long-range drones. Also, another Russia's chemical factory was hit with Storm Shadow cruise missiles. These missiles managed to penetrate and avoid Russia's air defense assets. What is your take on this another development? Is it another reason why Trump's administration is putting more pressure on Putin? And is it another tool of pressure on Vladimir Putin to allow this missile to fly over Russia's head?
I believe in the approval to get the British cruise missile approved for operations by Ukraine. The United States weighed in on that, and we gave our approval to do so. It's part of a number of steps leaning in the direction of going much more offensive in this case. Just to back up here just a little bit, under President Trump's leadership in the second Trump administration prior to the Biden administration, what you're seeing President Trump, he puts more pressure, Daniel, on our adversaries than he does on our allies. Now, granted, he's still trying to hold President Zelensky's feet to the fire in terms of diplomatic steps and so forth, and trying to make sure that there's not an outbreak of conflict across Europe in this case. But he's much more leaning towards supporting Ukraine, certainly supporting the EU and NATO, rather than putting pressure on Ukraine and NATO. We saw that in the Mideast as an example, where the prior administration was trying to put pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel to hold back on their counterstrike against Iran or against Hezbollah, and even to some degree against Hamas. President Trump is just flipping that in terms of the playbook, where he's now putting pressure on our adversaries. The adversary in this case is Russia and President Putin.
Let's also cover recent Russian nuclear drills. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has introduced a nuclear-capable missile with a nuclear-powered engine with so-called unlimited range, Burevestnik missile. Vladimir Putin says that this missile can fly for months and avoid all Western air defense asset. What was your assessment of this new missile?
A couple of things. Saying what it can do versus demonstrating literally what it can do are two different things. But I believe what President Putin is doing is he's seeing his back get up against the wall, even a little bit more so than a couple of weeks or so ago, or a couple of months or so. And that's why he's bringing out the threat of the development as well as the employment of these nuclear weapons capabilities. That's a card that worked against the Biden administration. I don't think it's going to work against the Trump administration. The fact is that Russia, however, still has the largest nuclear weapons stockpile in the world, with, I believe, in public assessment, and if you look at the data, about 5,500 nuclear weapons. The United States is second. We have about 5,000 or so, and then it falls off with other nations. But Putin and Russia have through the years have always been compelled to modernize their nuclear weapons forces, and not necessarily significantly increase the number of warheads, but trying to modernize the employment capabilities. And that's what you're seeing here, because he's not in a particularly good position. He still thinks he can win, against Ukraine, take over Ukraine, but it's not going well for him on the battlefield, as you keenly know, being there in Ukraine yourself. And so the other card that he has to play, or maybe the only card he has to play, is the threat of nuclear weapons development and the nuclear weapons employment. But I don't think the United States under President Trump is going to fall for that. That's where we need to. The only thing bullies understand is power, Daniel. And in this case, this bully's trying to play the nuclear card. I just don't think it's going to work against the United States and President Trump. My final point on that note is what also bothers Putin is he thought by now you would see gaps between the United States and Ukraine, or gaps between the United States and NATO and European Union. Actually, we've closed ranks. We've become much more tighter. There are some issues certainly behind closed doors, from a diplomatic standpoint between these, these nations that support one another. But publicly, it's a very strong, firm alliance, and that's what really troubles, I think, Putin.
Let's also cover the technical details of this missile. Can this missile fly for months with unlimited range? Is this a credible claim?
I haven't seen the intelligence on this capability. I think if you claim that you can fly for months, I think that is fairly far-fetched. But the fact is what Putin is trying to do is threaten with this capability, this missile technology that I don't think exists. But the fact that Russia is still trying to endeavor in nuclear weapons design, nuclear weapons capability, and nuclear weapons employment is still a concern. The fact is that that's how they really want to increase the threats against Ukraine, NATO, European Union, and the United States. But I still have not seen, at least in the public square, the capabilities that really he claims plays out. I just haven't seen it for my own eyes. I don't think it could be a test initiative. I don't think it's right now a real capability yet.
Also, U.S. President Donald Trump has directed nuclear drills by the U.S. armed forces. Could this be a response to Putin's nuclear threats?
I believe that we've done that actually through the years. I was a B-52 wing commander at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, where we also had hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And even during a period of time after Desert Storm and through the 90s and even into the 2000s, when we were focused on the global war on terror, we would routinely conduct nuclear weapons exercises in order to make sure that we were capable in organizing, training, and equipping our nuclear weapons forces and so forth, and certainly our delivery means with those weapons. We also wanted to demonstrate to our key adversary then was Russia, but now Russia and China, that we also have high-end capability. And what that leads to, Daniel, most importantly, is not necessarily our desire to use the weapons. However, what we're demonstrating is the capability and the will to do so should deterrence fail. We want to deter Putin. We want to deter President Xi from ever modernizing their nuclear forces, which they're doing right now. But the only way, one of the ways you can do to deter them is by certainly having the political will, but also demonstrating the capability. And that's what really these exercises from the U.S. standpoint is to demonstrate our capability it's also to exercise and practice to make sure our men and women who operate these capabilities are ready should that time come to use the weapons.
You just mentioned about China, and let's cover also China's and India's role in financing Putin's war machine. There have been some reports that China and India have reduced their oil imports from Russia. What is your take on that?
First and foremost, just a couple hours or so ago, President Trump and President Xi met at the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, in Seoul, South Korea, with a bilateral summit to talk about tariffs, U.S. levied tariffs against China, to talk about China's production of precursor chemicals for fentanyl. Fentanyl is then, by the Mexican drug cartels, sent to the United States. It's the largest drug killer of American citizens. There were a number of other issues to talk about, to include how China is modernizing their nuclear weapons capability, their own modernization of their force. So I believe what we have is a potentially a breakthrough on tamping down on what has been a very difficult period between the United States and China economically and financially based on tariffs. I think the threat of tariffs against China, and also, and I'm sure behind closed door, President Trump is encouraging President Xi to back off supporting the Russian oil economy and other aspects of the economy, and that would include India as well. And so what we're going to see here in the next couple of weeks is we're going to hold off on major tariffs against China, and we'll see how that plays out in terms of how China now views its trading partnership with Russia. If it backs off, that will have an immediate impact on the Russian oil economy, but we'll see. But I believe in the next couple of weeks, we'll see how, as I said, how it plays out. But I'm now fairly encouraged as to what has just recently been publicly stated in terms of a new economic partnership, or not a partnership, but now a relationship between President Trump and President Xi regarding tariffs, fentanyl drugs, and other economic aspects. But I think that will have an impact on the Russian oil economy.
Do you feel that President Trump has enough leverage over China and India to force them to completely stop buying Russian oil?
I don't know if I would use the word completely, Daniel, but there's influence there because of the economic relationship and dependence that the United States and China and India have. And I believe there is some leverage there that the president could use. One is a diplomatic leverage. President Xi really wants to have President Trump visit China. We can expect that in early of 2026. And then he's asked, I believe, that he wants to be invited by President Trump to visit the United States. That in and of itself, diplomatically, is leverage that could go into the economic aspect of it and perhaps embolden the relationship between the United States and China, which is a good thing, but also could be a downturn perhaps for the Russia-China relationship as well. And so we'll need to wait to see in that, but I believe that whereby the United States and China at the strategic level, certainly between President Trump and President Xi, where we can find some agreements and perhaps find some closer ties and relationships, certainly economically, is good for the United States and China and may not necessarily be good for Russia. We'll see how that plays out, however.
Also, according to Reuters, US is ready to impose additional sanctions on Russia if Vladimir Putin continues to reject ceasefire offer. How close we are to stage 2 of these sanctions against Putin's war machine?
I think we're very close to those stage 2 sanctions. Again, stage 2 sanctions to me is directly against Russia and Putin himself and his oligarchs, but it's also the stage 2 sanctions based on those nations that have close trade relationships, as we mentioned, with China and India, with Russia itself. I also want to underscore here, it's not just the sanctions themselves, Daniel, but it's the enforcement of the sanctions. And that's where it's very important that these now close ties between the United States, NATO, and the European Union, certainly, that they also close ranks with regard to enforcing the sanctions themselves. It's one thing for the United States to levy sanctions against Russia, or these stage 2 sanctions against Russia's trading partners. It's another thing, and a very important part of the sanctions themselves are the enforcement of the sanctions. But not only the United States, but the United States bringing leverage against our European partners, in this case, specifically in the EU, that they also enforce the sanctions just as with the same strong measures as the United States does. And so that's important, that this close cooperation between the United States and NATO and the EU militarily, just as important regarding the sanctions and the economic financial aspect of this.
Thank you, General Newton, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Daniel. Very, very pleased and proud to be on air with you at any time.